Hear these words from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 4, verses 8 through 11 from the NRSV. And again, the tempter took Jesus to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory, and said to him, all of these I give you, if you will fall down and worship me. And Jesus said to him, away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only God. And then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited upon him. And our second reading continues with Matthew's Gospel a bit later, again, presenting us with this dilemma of who or what is ultimate in our lives, God or money, the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of Caesar and Pharaoh and the titans of our times. Hear these words from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 24 through 34, again in the NRSV. And Jesus said to them, no one can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And so therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body or what you'll wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet God, our Creator, feeds them. And are you not more valuable than they? And which of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your lifespan? And why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not clothed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and gone tomorrow and thrown into the oven, will God so much more clothe you, you of little faith? Therefore, I tell you, don't worry, saying, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? For it is the non-believers who seek all these things. And indeed, God, our Creator, knows what you and I need. But seek first God's kingdom, God's righteousness, and all of these things will be given to you as well. So let us take a moment of prayer together. So today, in this reflection, we continue focusing on one of the most crucial moments, not only of Jesus's life, but also of ours, our own temptations in the wilderness, where our own needs for economic security, pride, and power over others becomes ultimate, becomes our highest priorities, become idols, our gods. So I think it's essential to understand that these temptations weren't unique to Jesus. They're common to all of us. Our daily lives were presented with so many opportunities to compromise our integrity. We're tempted constantly to place our ultimate faith in the almighty dollar. So I admit it, I have an unusual path to ministry by way of an MBA. My parents, who loved me very much and were deeply devout in their Christian faith, encouraged me to be practical given the economic realities of the world. So I was. And I'll tell you what saved me after business school was the why. It was the promise I made to myself and to God. I will work for a life-giving cause. So I began my career right after business school working for Hewlett-Packard Company in their medical electronics business, capital equipment. HP was then a very enlightened company, and working in healthcare technology and using these skills that I had learned toward a life-giving purpose made it incredibly meaningful for me. And without it, I wouldn't have had the passion and the energy to support the mission of being financially viable and strategically viable to help this great company make these products that would save people's lives, including my own mother's. And looking back, every step of my career in my life has been an opportunity to manifest that life-giving purpose ever more directly for myself and others. And I would go further to say that every single one of us, no matter what field we're in, what we're doing, there is an opportunity to manifest that life-giving purpose ever more directly, every step we make. I remember in junior high school reading the words of scientist and theologian Teilhard de Chardin from his book, The Divine Milieu. And he talked about us as spiritual beings having a human experience, and then talked about just how hard it is being human in this world, this kingdom. So throughout the years, my friends have teased me about my relationship with money, given my career path. And yes, subscribing to the Wall Street Journal and Fortune magazine. And one of my friends, my lifelong friends, when I went to seminary and graduated, gave me a book for graduation entitled God is My Broker. It's funny, and it's not. Because I'm tempted, we're all tempted, maybe not to control all the kingdoms of the world, like in the first reading that we heard. Maybe there's a few of you out there, but most of us aren't tempted to control on the scale of someone like an Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos and so many other multi-billionaires in this country, but certainly to be complicit with the vast political economic system that they are titans of, especially when we think about our futures. I think about my own future. Eventually, someday, I'll retire, and I wonder what's going to happen to Medicare, to Social Security. Will they be cut? Will they run out? What will this current Congress decide? Thinking ahead about savings, 401ks in the stock market. Will inflation erode whatever cash savings you and I have? Will the banks themselves go bankrupt, as we've seen just this past week with Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic at risk? And for those of us who are parents and grandparents, there's this added pressure of providing enough wealth, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren in what seems to be an ever more threatening world. And then there's the fears that we all have about abandonment, suffering, loneliness. The older we get, we experience the death and illnesses of more and more loved ones, family members, siblings. And then we experience our own vulnerabilities, as I did a month ago with back spasms that had me flat on my back on the floor. And I wondered, what would I have done without healthcare, without a car, without a cell phone? What would I have done without loved ones, Yvonne and Val and Peter, to be right there with me, to literally pick me up when I was unable to? After all, the titans of industry like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk aren't going to save me, but investing in their stocks might help. So, especially the Hebrew scriptures there's always this tension between the rulers of the time and God's vision. In Moses' time, it was the Pharaoh who held the Hebrew people in slavery and captivity. And then in Jesus's time, there were the Lord Caesar, Roman emperor, and there was King Herod, this collusion between religion and nation. And so today we may not worship these historical figures, but we still have our own modern day equivalents. We live in a world that idolizes and is deeply influenced by the titans of industry who are presented as the masters of the universe, who lord and rule over our lives and own half of the wealth of this country. We live in a country where much of institutionalized Christianity has been co-opted by this military industrial complex, this empire. And so all this week, I've been wrestling with the question that Jesus must have faced out there in the wilderness, 40 days, in the wilderness of his ministry. Why didn't Jesus decide to get a political, powerful position within the empire of his time? Maybe like King David did 1,000 years earlier, to change the system from the inside out. I think it's an important question, a question that I live with, and perhaps you do too, and wonder about, not only for Jesus, but for ourselves in a system that needs so much reformation. Perhaps Jesus experienced the kingdom of God as really not of Caesar's kingdom. And Jesus sensed that real power and authority comes from God, as real as creation itself, as real as every breath we take and our very heartbeats. That happens beyond our capacity to ever fully understand or control or replicate. And I also think that Jesus experienced and realized and understood that the system itself was broken and that it couldn't be fixed from within. The political, economic, religious system of his time was corrupt, so corrupt. Any attempts to change it from the inside would require compromise on his part and the sacrifice of integrity. Jesus, I think, knew that real change could only come also from the complete transformation of one person, one heart, one being at a time, and starting with himself in his own wilderness, following another outsider in the wilderness, John the Baptizer, who, because of his birth, easily could have been a religious political insider. So then there's the question of, given the system that's broken, religious systems are broken as well, religious institutions. And so how do we follow Jesus? How do we follow God, while at the same time being critical of the institution of religion? I mean, we may think that the spiritual but not religious movement is a new movement. John in the wilderness was that same spirit, the same movement. It's a question we all need to live with and wrestle with. And our doubt is our faith-seeking understanding. It is a healthy part of our faith. It means we're alive. And so here's some of my own latest thinking and following in the ways of Jesus. And I think it's really critical to recognize that the way of Jesus is very distinctive from the religion created in his name. I think that following in this way of Jesus requires a lot of humility and discernment and a willingness to challenge the status quo. I think it also requires actively seeking the truth and embodying the love and the justice and mercy that Jesus taught, even when it goes against the dominant narrative. I think it means being open to learning from other traditions and recognizing that no single path has a monopoly on truth. And finally, following in this way of Jesus requires a recognition that this way, following the God of liberation, is risky. Remember, Jesus was killed. And I believe that Jesus's death was a result of systemic injustice, oppression, and violence. There are many theories of atonement: ransom theory of atonement, substitutionary theory of atonement. In the 3rd century, St. Anselm introduced the idea that this was a willing outpouring of love. And I deeply believe that. And that Jesus, in that love for everyone, if you love everyone and respect everyone, justice easily follows. And so does a powerful critique of an unjust system. And this is what led to Jesus's death, his execution by the state. I believe that his death and his resurrection represent a profound act of love and redemption that inspire me, that inspire us to continue the work, to be led by that spirit, to hold as torchbearers the work of justice and liberation for all people. But back to that death point, speaking of death, how do we survive our fear of death and not worry and be like the birds and the lilies of the field, knowing that we are ultimately cared for by creation itself? I think it's a difficult task. It's not impossible. I think it does require a certain level of faith and trust in our Creator's provisions and recognizing all that we so easily take for granted. And I also think it requires acknowledging that we have a responsibility to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. It's not an either or, it's a both and. I also think that Jesus's teachings about not worrying and trusting, it's not an invitation to passivity or inaction, but it's an invitation to prioritize our relationship with God and to trust that God will provide for our needs, and we are invited to participate in that provision. We are invited to co-create, to work toward meeting our own needs and the needs of others in a responsible and compassionate way. It means recognizing our own agency and power to affect change, while also recognizing that we're not alone and we can't do it alone. I think it means building relationships with others who share our values and are committed to creating a more just and compassionate world. And I think it means holding on to despair in the face, holding on to hope in the face of despair, and trusting that God is present even in the midst of suffering. And ultimately, I believe that following Jesus is about embodying a way of life centered on love, justice, and compassion, about recognizing our interconnectedness with all of creation,